Hey, so I decided to do my mini lecture on John Stuart Mill. Uh, as I was reading through the textbook for this week's reading, um, he kind of stood out to me as an important figure in the history of psychology, among other fields, to include philosophy, economics, and other areas. Um, Yeah, so why don't we just go ahead and get started? So my first slide is the introduction slide. Um, so just to kick things off, John Stuart Mill was an influential figure in the history of psychology and of science in general. He was a philosopher, economist, and social reformer. Throughout the course of this presentation, we're going to cover who John Stuart Mill was, where he came from, his background, his education, uh, the work that he did, um, and what his major contributions were, and his continuing impact and legacy for our modern world. So, John Stuart Mill was born May 20th, 1806, and died May 8th, 1873. John was born in the north, in a really northern province in London, England. I can't remember the name. It starts with a P, I think. And he was raised in a highly intellectual environment. Mill Jr.'s father, James Mill, Mill Sr., was a prominent philosopher and economist, and in his own right, he published some work of his own about different topics, and was really influential in the development of his son's intellectual uh, abilities. Uh, Mill Sr. provided his son with such a rigorous education that ultimately included important topics such as Greek. He learned Greek real early, Latin, mathematics, and logic. It was he some of the research that I did for this presentation. They said that Mill Sr. kept Mill Jr. From being around other kids except for his siblings, just so he could focus on his education. So, as far as John Stuart Mill's education goes, he learned Greek at 3, Latin and algebra by the age of 8. Um, he wasn't eligible to study at Oxford and Cambridge, so Mill ultimately attended University College, and he followed in his father's footsteps and worked for the East India Company. Um, From 1865 to 1868, Mill served as a member of the Parliament. During his tenure, he became the first person to call for women to be allowed to vote and advanced social reforms and advocated for the alleviation of burdens on Ireland. So yeah, so Mills wasn't educated at the premier British colleges. However, he still managed to have an impact on the world, and it's kind of cool because you think about it in modern terms. People think, oh, you went to Harvard, you must be able to accomplish so many things. But even back in these days, when education was was looked at probably more mysteriously, um, they were able people who came from lower upbringings in terms of education, who didn't have that pedigree, so to speak, of being from Oxford and Cambridge, were still able to accomplish some really unique things and have a lasting impact on the world. John Stuart Mill wrote On Liberty. It's his most famous work. It was published in 1859, and it argues for individual liberty and freedom of thought and expression. The book has been influential in the development of modern liberal thought and is considered a classic of political philosophy. Mill's thoughts on liberty were actually, in this case, were derived from Joseph Priestley and Josiah Warren. So definitely a very thick read, but something that modern politicists look to when they think of, almost immediately that pops up when they think of John Stuart Mill. So on the topic of utilitarianism, which I'm really pleased with myself that I said that right the first time out, Mill is also is known for advancing this concept. He didn't come up with it initially, but he learned about it through a previous philosopher and advanced it, took it as his own and believed it. So he believed that he believed in this idea that actions should be evaluated based on their usefulness or utility. You know, what's the maximum amount of good that we can do for the maximum amount of people? I believe that the goal of any society should be to maximize happiness and minimize pain and suffering. Mill's ideas on utilitarianism have had a lasting impact on ethical and political philosophy to this day. And I think it's easy to see why. So utilitarianism is a really universal concept. I mean, I think it still holds true today, for me anyways. I think that we should do the most amount of good for the most amount of people in most situations, you know, and not cater to specific small subgroups. So John Stuart Mill came up with a different idea than his father. So his father originally came up with a mechanical interpretation of what was the topic? First, associationism. He came up with mental chemistry. I'll just start from the beginning. Was an idea introduced by Mill that replaced the idea of mental mechanics from his father, which originated from his father. Mill believed that the mind was made up of various mental elements or states, and he argued that mental states could combine to form more complex mental phenomena, similar to the way that chemical elements combine to form compounds. Mill's theory of mental chemistry was influential in the development of modern psychology, particularly in the cognitive sciences. Another thing that he's really well known for. Now, the term associationism, I think I kind of said that one right. So Mill made important contributions to this field. Again, he wasn't the one who came up with it, but he believes it and furthered it in his own way. So, what is associationism? I can't even say it. What is associationism? It's the idea that complex ideas are formed by combining simple ideas. He believed that the mind was capable of forming complex ideas by combining sensory experiences and mental states. Utilizing the mental chemistry metaphor that he came up with, that was in contrast to what his father had decided, the mechanical one, Mill proposed that the mind played an active role in the formation of associations instead of a passive role. In terms of the subconscious, so Mill didn't coin the term subconscious. The term subconscious didn't actually come into existence until later, until I think it was 1889. A French, or I can't remember off the top of my head, but a different person came up with that term. But he talked about it in some ways independently of having that term coined for him. In his book System of Logic, he discussed that the idea that mental processes occur at different levels of consciousness. He argued that many mental processes operate automatically and unconsciously. For example, Mill noted that individuals often make judgments or come to conclusions without being consciously aware of the reasoning that led to those conclusions. So in his own right, he was already talking about it before it was actually a thing. And I think some philosophers had talked about it previous to him too, maybe Aristotle or, I can't remember the other one's name, but ancient Greek philosophers. I think at some point that had already been discussed, but he had brought it up again in some of his works, in System of Logic specifically. Now, the nature versus nurture debate obviously wasn't started by him, but his belief on nature versus nurture was that, it's a little bit of both. And ultimately, figured it out before we figured it out, So I think I did a previous study in a different class where nature and nurture each represented pretty close to about 50% of, whatever personality characteristic you were examining. And then in terms of what Mill thought, in his System of Logic book that we discussed in the previous slide, he talked a lot about this. He believed that both genetics and the environment contribute to human development, that it is difficult to separate the two. He believed that people are born with innate tendencies and capacities, yet people are shaped by their environment and experience. So again, just really what he believed was a little bit of both. He thought that there was capacity in terms of your innate abilities, and then there was experiential events that coalesce or at least combine in their own way that's often really undefinable, in a way to figure out, in a way to present or produce a specific personality trait, characteristic, or ability. So what's Mill's legacy? Mill was influential in a lot of different areas. He was vast and varied, and he was widely regarded as one of the most important philosophers, economists, and political thinkers of the 19th century. His ideas on individual liberty, utilitarianism, and associationism have had a lasting impact on philosophy, psychology, and political theory, just to name a few. Many of his ideas are still relevant today and continue to shape our understanding of the world. So he's just another towering figure in the history of psychology and other fields that continues to have a lasting impact today. Just in a couple of the slides that we've already talked about, I really truly believe that his ideas kind of were the foundation for a lot of the things that we believe today in terms of liberal social agenda and different things. So I broke the biographical information up into two parts because I believe his origin story would be different than his towards the later of his life story. Now, Mill ended up getting married to Harriet Taylor in 1851, and it was a long and very unconventional courtship. I think they waited 2 years after her previous husband died, and I think there was even some controversy over the fact that they may have been talking while she was married to her previous husband. I think his name was John. Now, Harriet was a feminist and philosopher on her own. She collaborated with John on many of his work, and the couple had a close and affectionate relationship until she died in 1958. Her daughter from the previous marriage, Helen, worked closely with Mill after her mother's death on different things, to include issues related to feminism and social justice. She was his secretary and she was his companion. I don't think it was romantic in nature, but she was there to support him as a family member. In terms of his political activism, Mill ultimately served in the Parliament for 3 years after a long career with the East India Company. And during his time in Parliament, he advocated for a wide range of progressive reforms. These rights included women's suffrage, workers' rights, and the expansion of education. Mill was deeply committed to social justice issues, as I previously stated, and he was interested in advocating for policies that alleviated poverty. Now, he also believed that society had a responsibility to ensure that everyone had a fair chance to succeed, and that government policies should be designed to promote the well-being of all members of society, not just the wealthy or powerful. Now, towards the later years in his life, this includes his time in Parliament, Mill became increasingly involved in social reforms. He was instrumental in the passage of the Representation of People Act, which was passed in 1867, and this ended up extending voting rights for more people in Britain. After his wife died, he wrote that he never fully recovered from her loss, which I'm sure must have been devastating for him, and he died at the age of 66 from a skin infection that was believed to have been caused by a cut from shaving. Finally, to end it all, Mill was a towering figure in the 19th century philosophy, economics, and politics. He made many significant contributions to the field of ethics, political theory, economics, and psychology. And Mill's emphasis on individual liberty and autonomy remains a key aspect of contemporary beliefs, and his ideas have influenced many subsequent thinkers and social movements. Thank you for listening. I really appreciated the opportunity to share this with you. Hopefully I'm under time. Anyways, thanks. That's all I got.